Good and bad requirements. You'll soon see that even requirements have requirements, and we usually call them attributes. And in looking at a requirement just now, we saw that it was lacking in detail, or what we call completeness, and it was also lacking in clarity. Well, why don't we take a look at the attributes of good requirements, and I'm going to give you, I think it's six of them. Yeah, the first one is clear. It goes without saying that we should usually strive for clear communication. When a statement of some kind is lacking in clarity, it leaves the interpretation of the statement up to the listener or the reader. Well, that's even more the case with vague requirements. Usually, when a business analyst delivers unclear requirements to the project team, one of two things happens. Most of the time, the team will observe that there is a lack of clarity, and they'll ask the BA about it. And this is okay. It happens all the time. But it's a bit of a waste of time, right? The team member has to stop what they're doing to ask the BA what the requirement means, and the BA then has to clarify it for the team member. But then the BA has to make sure that that clarification is communicated to all the rest of the stakeholders so that everyone has an understanding about what the product is supposed to do. The worst scenario is when the team thinks they understand the requirement, but they don't. And if that situation isn't caught somehow, you could have the development team building the wrong thing. You could have the testing team writing and executing the wrong test cases. And usually by the time that's caught, it could be very late in the project or even after the product is released that you discover the problem. And then it can have a lot of impact on the project overall. If there isn't enough time or bandwidth for the development or testing teams to refactor their work, the project might have to be delayed, or the product might be delivered with a feature that doesn't work the way that it's intended. And that's a bad scenario. Let's imagine, for example, that the requirement above was misunderstood by the team. Perhaps the BA wanted the information to be a list of all the beverage sales transactions, but the development and testing teams understood it to require only summary level information. Well, if that problem wasn't caught until the system was released, they would have a real problem. Since the organization needs that transaction level report in order to do regulatory filings, they could have found themselves in hot water with their regulators, and that's something that is dangerous for any business. There are probably two primary tools as BAs that will help you to watch out for unclearly stated requirements, and I strongly recommend you do both on every project, every time. First, it's really helpful to go through the requirements with a colleague and see what confuses them. I usually call this the peer review. Ideally, the colleague should be able to read the requirements and then explain them to you without any help. Anything that confuses your colleague should probably be clarified in text. If you can't get a colleague to devote some time to this, then I understand the reality of the workplace. These days, everybody is super busy. But, at the very least, do a clarity check yourself. The second tool is the requirements walkthrough. And we're going to be talking about this a lot during the course. Walkthroughs are extremely common, and I can't think of any projects I've run where there wasn't at least one walkthrough performed. The idea is to set up a meeting or, in a worse scenario, a conference call, where you walk through the requirements with your stakeholders. In these reviews, your stakeholders should chime in with anything they see as unclear or incorrect, missing, etc. Walkthroughs are probably your best weapon against unclear requirements. And again, do both on every project. Now, with that said, let me caution you against just explaining things to your stakeholders verbally and expecting them to remember. Your requirements must be able to stand on their own. If someone asks a question or makes a comment about a requirement, you probably have to amend the requirements document to account for it. Okay. The next attribute we'll look at is also one that we've referred to already, and that is complete. Having complete work is also kind of a no-brainer, and it's also very important that we have complete requirements. Well, what do we mean by complete? We really just mean that the written requirement contains all of the information necessary for those who depend on it to complete their work. When requirements aren't complete, we usually end up in situations like we discussed before. The developer or the testing professional has to stop what they're doing to call you up and ask the question. And then you have to make sure that the requirement documentation is then completed, usually after a fair amount of analysis, and then that the updates are adequately communicated, etc. Usually, incomplete requirements are obvious to development and testing teams. With a fair amount of experience, they will soon become obvious to you as well. But while you're starting out, I would depend on the same two tools that we discussed before, the peer review and the walkthrough. They should help you raise any problems to light. The next attribute is what I call applicable. There are other words which I sometimes hear thrown around, which I'm not crazy about. Sometimes people say relevant, which is probably too loosely worded. You might also hear necessary, which I think is too exclusive. Let me explain what I mean by this. The concept is that the requirement that you write must be applicable to the solution that you're recommending. And also that your solution is applicable to the problem or goal of your stakeholders. So, a requirements document shouldn't just be any collection of requirements thrown together that represent a bunch of changes to your product. No, each document should be aimed at solving a problem of your organization. If your requirement doesn't belong to the solution, you should probably remove it and put it in its right place, whatever that should be. I'll give you an example. Let's say the requirements we've been discussing so far are for a new customer relationship management system, CRM system for a food and beverage company. If you're not familiar with CRM systems, they essentially help you to sell to customers, service your customers, and they typically serve as the official record of all of your customer information and data. Now let's say one of your stakeholders suggests that you add a requirement for an inventory of the company's products, and that you put that in the CRM system. Well, there's probably a good reason for the request your stakeholder is making, but it doesn't sound immediately applicable to the solution that you're working on. And you should probably discuss with your PM or boss whether or not you should put that requirement in your documentation, or whether it should be referred to another person or team or project for handling. Okay. The next attribute we'll look at is prioritized. Prioritization is pretty straightforward and easy. Sometimes it's even fun to do. But for whatever reason, a lot of BAs skip this step, and it often causes problems later on. Prioritized simply means that a priority has been given to the requirement. But it's not you deciding what the priority is. It's usually not even the project team. Most often, it's the sponsor of the project, or their representative, that's giving priorities. Sometimes on larger projects, there is a group or a committee of stakeholders that confer together and prioritize the requirements for you. But it's a different process in different organizations. What happens when requirements aren't prioritized? You end up in sticky situations. The development team, for example, they might start working on requirements that are less important in the eyes of your sponsor than other requirements that they've deferred. And then scheduling problems can cause the product to lack important features when it's actually released. Yeah, not prioritizing requirements is a recipe for project delay and organizational infighting. Fun stuff. A good requirement is prioritized. We'll be talking about how and when to prioritize requirements a bit later in the course. The last two requirements attributes we'll discuss could be lumped together under the term realistic, but there is value in discussing them separately, so we'll do it that way. The first of the two is implementable. What this means is that from an implementation or development point of view, the requirement can be realized in tangible code or steps in the process. And also that the requirement can be feasibly implemented within the existing constraints of the team. The requirement is essentially not making any irrational implementation demands. It's easiest to discuss this attribute in examples. Let's say you have a requirement for the system to generate a report instantaneously. Well, that's going to present a problem. Instantaneous means that from start to finish, the system has to generate the report in 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, and 0 milliseconds. And that's just not feasible. It takes time for systems to perform any task. Another favorite example of mine is when a requirement specifies that a system be able to handle an infinite number of something. Well, that's also not feasible from a system perspective. Infinity is a big enough number for no system to be able to handle it, or at least not in any finite amount of time. But there are other more subtle issues that more commonly arise. For example, if you have a requirement that ends up being too big to develop in time, or if it requires the purchase of a software module that's just way too expensive for the budget, well, you also have issues there with non-implementable requirements. To avoid this kind of issue, understanding the capabilities and limitations of systems will help, but probably your best defense is a review by your implementation team. Very similarly, we need our requirements to be testable. This simply means that the requirement can be converted into a test case. A requirement that requires an infinite capacity cannot be tested, let alone implemented. This attribute goes hand in hand with being implementable. They usually do go together. Pay attention to that tip I just put on the screen. The only reason I break this attribute out separately is to get you to include your testing team when you're conducting your requirements review process. That's really important. All right, that's all the requirements attributes we're going to cover. I will say that there is a lot of info about these and other attributes online. They're definitely worth checking out.